travel's become faster and more accessible, we're also seeing it become more vulnerable in time of geopolitical tension and rising strain. To discuss this topic and more, I'm joined today by Krum Garkov, who is the former executive director of the European Agency for the Operational Management of Large IT Systems and currently the EU Policy Advisor to VFS Global. Could you describe a bit more about what you're doing today?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure, and it's always a pleasure to get back to discussions about policies of the EU related to borders, migration, internal security. I'm a policy advisor for VFS, especially on the EU. And if someone asks why VFS needs a policy advisor for EU, it's very simple. VFS, although it's not normally on the front lines, already 20 years, supports EU member states in implementation of really critical EU policies, in particular EU common visa policy, but ambition goes beyond that. And I truly believe that VFS can offer more to the member states in other areas. This is something that we will discuss today.
Absolutely. I want to zoom out a bit into the broader topic of today, which is how borders and travel has evolved. So going from your very long experience within this field in building systems and advising on policy, could you set the scene a bit of what you're seeing today when it comes to borders and travel?
It's a quite complex picture. I will try to simplify it though. Before and in order to understand what is today, we need to look a little bit back in the past. So 20 or 25 years ago, what was the standard for a secure border? It was a border with a high fence, and then the higher the number of the border guards behind the fence were, the more secure the border was. Today, that's nonsense. Today, borders are pretty much into virtual space. They are driven by data, analytics, and risk management. And that's a fundamental transformation of border management that happened and continues to happen globally. Now, of course, in Europe, that has a different flavor because there are two major trends from my perspective that shaped the developments in European border and migration management in the last 10, 15 years. The convergence of policy areas that 10, 15 years ago were considered to be completely separate. I'm talking about border management, internal security, and migration management. Now they come together. On the other hand, and especially after the migratory crisis in 2015, the EU citizens more and more demand better internal security and higher efficiency of border management, and they see that as a critical issue. So those two driving forces combined forced EU and member states to act. And as a result, or what part of the response was launch of very ambitious transformation program related to the way external borders are managed and experience of the travelers and industry. So we are living that transformation into that transformation today, and it will continue.
As you did mention, so now we're starting to see a lot of this around migration, visa policy, Schengen digitalization, and efforts to open new legal pathways to migration too.
Exactly.
A key milestone within this has been the full rollout of the entry and exit system. Can you briefly explain what is this entry and exit system and what does it change for the EU in practice?
The entry-exit system is one of the fundamental building blocks of that digital transformation or new information architecture that EU started to build more than 10 years ago. In simple words, entry-exit system comes to fill some of the existing gaps in the information that EU and member states in particular collect from third country and for third country nationals coming into Europe. And in simple terms, the system can be compared with a ledger book, which takes note of each entry and exit from the external borders of the EU of third country nationals, and also supports the identification of overstays, because as you know, EU visa policy has strict rules about 90 days stay within 180 days period. So entry-exit system helps with that. But in a broader sense, entry-exit system provides different benefits to the different stakeholders in that huge and very complex ecosystem. For the member states, as I said, efficiency at the borders, because there are no anymore stamping of passports. The information collected from third country nationals is completely digital. Therefore, border guards can focus on other more important and value-added activities like risk management, for example. For the travelers, faster border crossing. I know you may say, but now we'll have queues. But we can talk about that.
Yeah,
And I
no
think
problem.
the whole perception of what is happening now and what will happen in the future is a bit influenced from the not very positive experience of some travelers today. So for the travelers, definitely faster border crossing, and for the industry, better risk management, including reduction of losses. Because if a third country national that is not supposed to enter Europe boards a flight, then the return of that person is at the expense of the carrier. So this is risk and loss for the carriers. So entry-exit system helps to reduce that risk for the industry. So as you see, there are multiple benefits for the different stakeholders within the ecosystem.
I did have some questions specifically about the different players within this ecosystem, but you framed it quite well. I want to focus primarily a bit on the member state level and in terms of approaching the implementation of the system. Do you see any notable differences in how it's rolling out?
The rollout is pretty unified because the system itself follows standardized technical requirements, standardized operational procedures. So, and that was one of the purposes, to also support further implementation of integrated border management. Where the differences coming from? The difference is coming from the different conditions and setups in the border crossing points in the different member states. Because let's face it, that large-scale IT system requires quite complex infrastructure at the borders and at least enough space for deployment. The border crossing points at the external borders of the EU, they've been designed and built decades ago when no one was thinking about entering the system. So there are intrinsic limitations in the implementation, and member states that needs to follow the uniform rules, uniform standards, uniform legislation, need to find out to implement it into particular context of the particular border crossing point. They're implementing the same things, but they take into account reality on the ground. And this is where the differences that are seen come from.
Because we've seen the initial rollout taking place since October, and full implementation is still starting to settle across Europe. What would you say is the steepest learning curve for the member states, where the reality on the ground, as you mentioned, is quite different?
Well, I think, first of all, the steepest learning curve is not only for the member states, first, because this kind of huge transformations always has three major components. One is the technology. Technology is the entry-exit system, the border infrastructure. It works. If someone says it doesn't know, it works first. Then the second layer, the second building block is the operational procedures, how that technology is employed. Those procedures are also in place. They are standardized. They also work. And the third component is what you just mentioned, the learning curve, because let's face it, nothing can start working as expected overnight. So there is a learning curve for the border authorities to utilize the full potential of the system. There is a learning curve for the operators of airports, for example, for the carriers, to basically employ the new capabilities and new ways of working. I closely followed the rollout of the system from October last year now to 10th of April when the full rollout was announced. I also followed the information in different media about problems. I'm far from arguing that there were no problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the important thing is to understand what is the root cause of those problems. To me, the biggest or one of the most serious reasons for those problems that were observed is exactly the learning curve for the travelers, maybe insufficient information provided to the travelers, because now in this initial period, to reduce or avoid queues, to make the experience of border crossing more relaxed for the travelers, is to provide as early as possible the necessary information for registration. The only channel for pre-registration available is the self-serving kiosks installed at the border crossing points, especially at the airports. What I observed, those kiosks were empty. In most of the cases, people were simply queuing at the border crossing, and when they were reaching the border guard, obviously everything had to be done in real time with the border guard, which takes time. So that's to great extent the reason for the queues and congestions. So in that sense, now I would say, besides other factors, of course, finding ways to move the information collection, the pre-registration, pre-enrollment in EES as far away as possible from the physical external borders of the EU is one of the ways to help member states and member states to help themselves to reduce the queues, to reduce the pressure.
Well, from October to April, that's only 6 months. What would you hope for the next 6 months to look like?
Well, first of all, 6 months is quite a lot of time. There was no such a thing like transition period. It was introduced only very recently to basically reflect the fact that the preparation readiness of the member states was not even an equal across the board in EU. So now for the next 6 months, that will be, to me, the adjustment period, meaning since the system is fully operational, those small nitty-gritty details for each and every border crossing point, because as I said before, there are differences. So all those small details that affect efficiency should be identified and fixed. But at the same time, in the long run, member states, from my perspective, should use that period also to develop further the alternatives for pre-enrollment, for a very simple reason. Pre-enrollment as such is not regulated by the legislation for EES. The legislation only opens the possibility for the member states to introduce so-called self-serving systems for pre-enrollment, but it's up to the member states to define the channels that afterwards they will make available to the member states. For the moment, few member states are trying the mobile app that was developed by Frontex, which is one of the possible channels. The downside of the app is that it does not collect all the data. It collects only alphanumerical data and the facial image, but then the fingerprints still need to be provided there. If member states find a way to establish other channels that can provide them all the necessary data in advance, that will be one of the accelerators that they can use in order to make the operations of EES at the external borders more efficient, to reduce the congestions and get the benefits from introduction of the system sooner rather than later.
You were speaking about it a bit earlier of what this shift actually means for the travelers as well as the wider industry. Can you speak a bit more in depth of, again, going for the next 6 months of how you see some of this evolving and improving for the industry and for travelers at large?
The period of adjustment after the full-scale rollout of the system, because member states, the industry generally, carriers, airport operators, travelers, they're part of the same very complex ecosystem, and that adjustment will be equally valid for all of them, although that for each of those stakeholder groups, there will be different perspectives, different nuances. But that will be the period of adjustment. The most important thing for me will be to kind of increase to the maximum the information, the scope and breadth of information that is available to the travelers in order to reduce that period of adjustment so that they know what they need to do in order to avoid the queue and to help the border authorities to do more efficiently and faster their job.
As we're running out of time, and I want to conclude this on a more constructive note, and as we're going to follow this closely and how it starts to shift for the traveler as well as for the industry and the member states at large, could you perhaps leave us with a message that you want to impart on the member state level and what you hope to see as a ripple effect for travelers coming and leaving Europe?
Obviously, for the travelers, the best effect will be to get to the point where border crossing is really smooth and fast without necessarily need to stay on a queue. Now, for the member states, my message is very simple because, well, many years I had the privilege and the chance to work with them trying to solve the same problems that we're discussing now. They should really think a bit out of the box, and I will explain. Out of the box because, as I said, today we see convergence of policies which normally in the past were implemented separately in silos. And this kind of silo thinking still exists. But at the same time, world today is much more interconnected, much more converge, including from policy, operational, and technical point of view. And member states really have a chance now to benefit from that. Let me explain. I started at the beginning with a short note about what VFS does already for the member states, supporting success of the implementation of the EU visa policy. In fact, what we're talking about now, about ES, about border management, is not very different. Because again, it's a policy that has a global reach, that has effects globally on each and every third country national that decides to come here to Europe. And if I'm in the shoes of the member states, I will think and I will realize that they already have in their hands instruments that they can reuse in a different way. The network of visa application centers existing already, serving visa policy, but having the same capabilities, the same infrastructure, the same level of security, if you like, that is implicit and necessary for pre-enrollment in ES. There are two choices, of course. You may decide to build that network on its own. Yeah, probably it will take some time, some resources, or again, to think out of the box and to use what already exists and works well to serve existing policies, expanding the use of the same capabilities and networks and tools towards other policies. So in that sense, I would really make an analogy between VFS and Swiss Army knife. You've seen it.
Yes.
Yeah, the Swiss Army knife is a universal tool. You decide what to do with it. Same is with the network of VFS. Member states can decide how to use it smarter and even more efficiently than they do today.
Well, thank you so much, Krum, for discussing this topic as well as telling us a bit more about VFS. There's a lot more to unpack, perhaps in future episodes, but it was such a delight to have you here today. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe.